A few weeks ago, I hosted an event with Brooklyn Jews showcasing the work of one of the artists that I've been working with over the past year. It was a Sunday morning, and I woke up early to prepare and to take care of a few things in advance of the presentation. I thought through what I was going to say, and when I then sat down to start the webinar, the waiting room hadn't been enabled. There were already a handful of people on the call, and with my camera turned on automatically, they all saw that in my busy preparation for the event, I had forgotten to get dressed. One person politely said, "Rabbi, perhaps you should put on some pants." At which point I dove outside of the camera's view and I crept back up to turn off my camera until I got everything sorted out. Now, to be clear, I wasn't totally naked. No one was scandalized. And for that matter, the people on the call had come for an experimental arts event. And I think that's a forgiving kind of group. But in that moment, I was horrified. I was exposed, vulnerable, and totally at odds with what I or anyone else had expected given my role. Perhaps that feeling resonates with you. You don't need to have shown up naked for a Zoom bar mitzvah to relate to that experience of being unusually exposed in front of a computer screen over the past few months. Every one of us has had to reconstruct our professional and personal lives before a camera this year. On top of the trauma of a pandemic and the emotional toll of social distancing and isolation, we've had to open a window into our homes, our most vulnerable space, to interact with almost anyone. Each of us has exposed ourselves. We've shown more of our blemishes and disarray to people than we otherwise would have. We've had to get comfortable with the discomfort of people seeing what we look like up close, how our kitchens and bedrooms and living rooms are decorated, and seeing the people with whom we share our most intimate lives. Even if we've been appropriately clothed on every Zoom call, our lives have been laid bare in an unusual way this year by moving things to the virtual space. We've all been naked before the world. And here we are in that same mode at the holiest time of the year. Nakedness is not a metaphor that we find in our liturgy, in part because Jewish tradition is not especially comfortable with it. Despite a religious culture that celebrates and emphasizes the human body, our classical inclination toward modesty eschews nakedness in most settings, especially, I might add, for Jewish clergy. In Exodus 20, we read that an Israelite priest shall not ascend an altar in such a way that his nakedness becomes exposed on the altar steps, referring to the skirt-like vestments of the priest, which could reveal his body without the proper undergarments. The Torah commands that no part of the priest should be exposed even to the stones upon which he is stepping. A midrash suggests that a priest can't be naked in front of the altar stones because it could embarrass them. And embarrassing stones, like embarrassing people, is equivalent to murder. Elsewhere, the rabbis condemn the kind of nakedness that leads to immoral behaviors. And if I sat here listing all of the rabbinic vexations against nudity in that context, we'd be here till Yom Kippur. But there is one very important and famous counterexample, one classical text that conveys nakedness in a positive light, if only for a split second. And this is a text that many of you know already from the creation story. After detailing the bounty of the Garden of Eden, every tree that was pleasing to the sight and good for food, Genesis 2 describes creating Adam and Eve with the words, "Vayihyu shnehem arumim." They were both naked. Ha'adam v'ishto, man and wife, v'lo yitboshashu. And they were not ashamed. In the very beginning, the nakedness of humanity was pure. And the Torah goes out of its way to say that Adam and Eve were not ashamed by their nudity, even if this is merely a foreboding of what happens next. After Adam and Eve follow the advice of the serpent and eat a forbidden fruit from the tree of knowledge, after they lose their innocence, they become aware of their nakedness. And as they realize what they had done wrong, they become ashamed of their bodies. In this same episode, Adam and Eve are also condemned to mortality, cast away from the Garden of Eden into a world in which they will one day die. We could say that the moment that they become human is the moment that they slip up. And during the season, when we consider the ways in which we too slip up, we may be comforted by recognizing that the experience of being human has always been intertwined with the inevitability of missing the mark. But I'm stuck on the purity of humanity's nakedness at the dawn of creation. Not only because I want to redeem my own mishap being less than fully clothed before an audience, but because tonight on Rosh Hashanah, we imagine that all of us right now are back at the beginning in the Garden of Eden, a place of abundance with no need to cover up. Our prayer book asserts multiple times, as we heard just tonight, Hayom Harat Olam, which we often translate as today is the birthday of the world. This echoes the teaching of the Talmudic sage Rabbi Eliezer, who argued that Tishrei, the month we enter tonight, marked the very beginning of time. And therefore, Rosh Hashanah, the first of Tishrei, is the moment that it all began. What then are we really doing here as we imagine ourselves to be in Eden? On Rosh Hashanah, when we enter a 10-day period of deep introspection, we're invited to remember that very first moment when it was safe to exist without a shield, without a covering, without a mask. We're called to remember the original before times, when we felt safer exposing ourselves, when we didn't even consider the need to cover up. It's obvious that as we engage in cheshbon hanefesh, an accounting of our souls during this season, that each of us have messed up. We've eaten forbidden fruits and fallen from Eden in various ways over the past year. But the high holidays beckon us to imagine that we can return to a moment of purity each year at this time. And the nakedness inherent within returning to Eden is a summons for us to open up, to take off our coverings, to unmask ourselves and submit to the vulnerability of right now. We enter these holidays tonight, as we all know, in front of a screen. That may require a little extra work from us to take Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur seriously. But maybe the medium is a surprise blessing. Maybe it's an opportunity for us to get a little more vulnerable, to reveal somewhat more of ourselves than we normally would. Not too much, hopefully, but just the right amount for us to take repentance, tshuva, looking inward, seriously. For the past 6 months, I've addressed you, my congregation, from right here. And if it felt weird for you, believe me, it felt weird for me speaking without seeing all of your faces. But as the pandemic unfolded, I had an opportunity to share with you what my life really looked like. In virtual classes and meetings, you've seen more of me than I normally show. In sermons, I've been upfront about what this year has been like for me, in ways that I hope have resonated with you. I've been messy. I've been naked. Many of you know that this year was probably the most challenging year of my life, for reasons that had nothing to do with the pandemic. And though it would have been intuitive to try to hide that, since my work demands that I care for others, specifically this community, I didn't. I've been honest about the pain and confusion of my personal life this year. And as a result, you saw me. It's hard for me to imagine experiencing 2020 without all the ways in which this community has been my lifeline. By being vulnerable, by exposing myself, I opened up myself for you to see me. And as many of you have revealed a similar vulnerability to me, I've had a chance to see you. All the more so as we organized the CBE membership with CBE Connects this spring, and many of you had one-on-one conversations with people whom you may never have met before. You saw each other, maybe only for 5 minutes one time in April, but that too began with an invitation to remove the barriers between you and to get real. Maybe time again now to see what happens when we reveal a little more of ourselves, even as we remain separated by screens. Perhaps it's time tonight to really imagine that we are in Eden together. The fact that the world around us does not feel like paradise only makes our imagining that much sweeter. And it's essential to uncover ourselves if we're going to make a change in our lives for the year to come. As far as I can tell, all of you are appropriately dressed here on Zoom tonight. And if you're joining us on Facebook Live, God bless. But no matter how we chose to dress ourselves for this service, no matter how we're accessing these holidays, may we remember that these days are really about peeling back the fabrics that conceal us and taking off our masks, at least while we're not in person right now. This year, we know that Rosh Hashanah isn't about crafting the perfect menu for tonight's dinner. It's not about looking great in our holiday best. This year, we get a chance to return not only to the origin of the world, but also to the original purpose of this holiday, being as real and raw and open as possible. Shana Tova.